Welcome officially to part two of Or Group's webinar series called Attracting Mega Philanthropy. And just to be clear, we're talking about mega philanthropy, not mega blocks, which is a common toy that my son loves. So you can imagine the amount of megas going around my house right now. But no, really, thanks for joining. Just a little context on October 28th. The other week, my colleague and good friend Craig Shelley kicked off this series by interviewing Mindy Barham from CDO of Grameen America, as well as Chuck Harris, the CDO of Blue Meridian. So thanks to everyone for joining that, and thanks for those who attended to that one and now are attending this one. I believe the stats from that one were Grameen's in the middle of a $300 million campaign right now, and Blue Meridian, okay, you ready? The number there that they've raised was 2.8 billion with a B. So that means, Sheryl, we got our work cut out for us. But while I have everyone on the line, I just want to do a plug for part three of our series. So if you're on Outlook right now in this virtual world, I presume you are, please definitely go put a hold on your calendar for November 17th at 1 p.m. My old man, my boss, my good friend, mentor, Steve Orr, will be interviewing David Rubenstein, who's a Giving Pledge member, co-founder, co-executive chairman of Carlyle Group, and president of the Economic Club. What I realized there is whoever has a long title like that must be really important. So that'll be a good one. I hope you do join. So here we are in part two. We definitely don't have any middle child syndrome here. I think this is going to be the best one, where all the meat in the conversation is. And I'm honored and thrilled to be joined by Sheryl. You are technically a client, but I also will consider you my colleague, friend, leader during this time, and all around just really a great person, Sheryl Dorsey, president of Echoing Green. So thanks for joining us.
Sure.
So before I let you take it away, Sheryl, just some quick stats. Thanks for everyone attending. We have over 350 people here today. Over 90% are nonprofits. I've noticed, I was just looking at the attendee list, a lot of our clients like Obama Foundation, Prospect Park, Girl Scouts, Arthritis, You Think, Just Capital, et cetera, have joined. So thanks for everyone for jumping in and taking this time. Sheryl, I'd like to actually kick it off before I let you talk a little bit about, or before I let you kind of introduce yourself and talk about Echoing Green. I really just wanted to do some very rapid fire questions to get a sense of kind of the numbers that we're talking about. So I might just gonna ask you a few questions. If you can just give me a quick answer, and then we'll go into kind of the content. My first question for you is, what's been your annual budget over the past few years on average?
So it sort of depends on, how we can sort of get ourselves across the finish line in terms of our revenue goals. And I would say when we're having a particularly tough year, maybe it's 8.5 or so. But if we're really killing it and we've got a good year, I would say just below 10. So anywhere between 8.5 million to a little less than 10.
Okay, now this is going to be the fun part. In the past 3 months, I'm going to give a name, and you're going to tell me what type of size gift this individual organization gave. So let's do Mackenzie Scott.
10 million.
Jerome L. Green Foundation.
10 million.
Skoll Foundation.
6 million.
MacArthur Foundation.
5 million.
Comcast.
2.5 million.
BlackRock.
1 million.
And all the others combined. Do you know the answer to that one?
Gosh, I don't, but probably a couple million when you add it all up. Yep.
So adding it all up to around 36 million. So I feel as though if I had one of those Zoom emoticons, the clapping thing, I'll put that up right now. Really great job. And that's just been a few months. Congratulations to you and all of the Echoing Green team. Really phenomenal work. So that's kind of just wanting to setting the stage of what we're defining as mega gifts, as you brought in 6 or 7 over the past few months. So with that, Sheryl, I'd really love for you just to introduce yourself and tell us about Echoing Green.
Sure, and I should have kicked it off and said thank you, CJ. Really appreciate you and the OR group for inviting me, but also for creating this space to have this important conversation. I mean, all of us who are, trying to make the world a better place, running important nonprofits, our constant struggle and our usual worry is how do we generate the resources we need to do the good work we're trying in the world to do. So the question of fundraising, especially over time, sort of the sustainability question is, certainly what keeps me up at night a lot. So I think this is important that you bring groups like us together to think our way through it and take away some learnings that allow us to do our work better. So thank you for that. And I'm really honored that folks took time out of their busy days to join for this conversation because it's an important one. So my name is Sheryl Dorsey. I am president of Echoing Green. Echoing Green is an early stage funder of emerging social entrepreneurs. We've been at this work for over 30 years now, almost 35, and over that period of time have become one of the most important and recognized leaders in the field of social innovation. And it's our work in the world to launch tomorrow's global leaders in social innovation. And we really focus on three things. First, we really work hard every year to find a diverse group of leaders through a global search. We then invest millions of dollars in seed funding each year in them as emerging leaders, as well as their fledgling social enterprises. And then three, we work really hard to build community. We work hard to connect the leaders in our portfolio to the Echoing Green and broader social innovation community through knowledge, through technical support, to supporting their well-being as leaders, and helping to build the collective power of our community. If you are at all familiar with the social innovation ecosystem, you will know that Echoing Green has been really important to the sector in helping to diversify the voices in our space. And when you look back over the last decade, about 75% of our US fellows are leaders of color, about 50% of our fellows identify as women, and globally, 75% of our fellows over the past decade can be described as proximate leaders, that they're of the communities they serve. And it's a wonderful, extraordinarily inspiring group of now close to 900 or so Echoing Green fellows and alums. And even if you haven't heard of Echoing Green, you probably know of some of our, I guess, best known former grantees, folks like Mrs. Michelle Obama or Van Jones, writers like George Packer. Certainly you're familiar with iconic brands in the social innovation space, whose leaders got their start through support of Echoing Green, whether it's City Year or Teach for America or One Acre Fund or Last Mile Health. And then a new generation of leading social innovators that are doing extraordinary work around racial equity, whether it's Girl Trek, which is now the largest public health nonprofit for African-American women and girls in this country, or Push Black, which is now the nation's largest nonprofit media organization for African-Americans. They're currently serving about 9 million people across all of their platforms. So a really rich array of next gen, incredible social change leaders and organizations. So that's us.
That's great, Cheryl. Thank you. I want to point out that one of the important stats that you mentioned there was 50% of the fellows are of color, 50% identify as women, and then 70% were proximate in the communities that they serve.
75%.
75%, excuse me.
Yeah.
And I know that those metrics are really important in terms of fundraising as we include them in every outreach we do, right? Those are the top three. And I thought that was really important to highlight. Very good. So thank you. I wanted to kind of follow a timeline over the past year that would give some context on why you've gone from 10 million to 35 million in just a few months. And I'm going to ask for your help to kind of walk us through that journey. So in 2020, you, before there were any uprisings or any events during the summer, released years worth of work that you did with Bridgespan called Disparities in Funding for Leaders of Color. And you were featured, this work was featured and the New York Times, Stanford Social Innovation Review, Chronicle of Philanthropy, the Harvard Business Review, Yahoo Finance, and you even got yourself in the Wall Street Journal. You're a celeb. I love it. Can you tell us a little bit about the work and just some of the high-level findings?
Yeah, and thank you for those shout outs. And you will contextualize it maybe for some of the listeners in a couple of ways. And I sort of put this under the umbrella of, how do you as a nonprofit make a moment versus how do you meet a moment? And I think the story that I'm about to tell and that you'll hear through the numbers is in many ways sort of a combination of both. We've all heard that adage, like you've got to make the road by walking. Echoing Green has been walking this road for 30 plus years, but also meeting a moment where, in the spring of this year, this country experienced the full force of two pandemics. One was the global COVID-19 pandemic, which has disproportionately had its boot on the neck of communities of color. I was just on an earlier call, and to have reminded people that as of today, our country has lost 1 out of every 920 African Americans. It's like 1 out of every 1,120 Native Americans, 1 out of every 1,300 or so Latinx of our fellow citizens. Like the disproportionate impact of this scourge on communities of color has been horrific and heartbreaking. And when you pair that with the murder of Mr. Floyd on May 25th, it was for many people the first time that structural racism was made visible, right? There were folks in the trenches for many years who had their shoulder to the wheel of fighting against structural racism, working to unpack and dismantle these forces that prevent too many of us from having full opportunity in this country. And all of a sudden, we were all confronted with it. And it was so jarring and so jolting. So in this moment, the world's attention turned to this concept of structural racism in a way it had not before. And I don't quite feel comfortable calling it luck or serendipity, but there were many of us who had just sort of been going about the work of trying to make the world a little more equitable. And all of a sudden, the rest of the world woke up and started paying attention. And that's what you were referencing, CJ, through our joint research project that we launched with Bridgespan over a year ago. And it comes from, again, a decade of data collection that Echoing Green had done. So you may not have heard of Echoing Green, but in our field, we are quite well known. And our track record is unbelievable. We are really good talent spotters, right? So every year we get 3,500 submissions from 160 countries around the world. We are ultimately only able and will only select less than 1% of those who apply to us for funding. And then when you look at what happens to those social innovators, the impact stats are pretty remarkable, right? Within a couple of years of entrance into the Echoing Green community, these social innovators are raising 13 times the amount of capital as the unselected ventures that we didn't have occasion to work with. When you look at how the organizations grow, we all know how under-resourced and how fragmented our sector is. And when you look at the number of nonprofit organizations that ever sort of make it past an annual budget of $5 million annually, it's less than like 3% of nonprofits. Like quadruple that percentage have bypassed that stat in our community. So we are really good at adding leverage, right? We are really good at optimizing the trajectory of these organizations. And, we participated in a study done by Emory University on the power of an array of global accelerators, incubators, and fellowship programs. And we look like a best-in-class incubator or accelerator. But it is interesting that those stats, it was still hard for us to get that message out to funders, even though we've been doing that work well for so many years. it was this conversation around racial equity that in this moment, in this devastating moment where these twin pandemics were bumping up against one another, that all of a sudden the work around racial disparities in access to funding for leaders of color broke through in a way that we've never seen before. We're just good data nerds at Echoing Green, and every year we sort of track what happens to the folks who come into our pipeline. We track them demographically, we track how their organizations are doing. And every year for like the last decade, annually, we would put out a blog post saying, it's really interesting to us that we are so good at sourcing best in class early stage talent. But even when they become finalists for our program, or even when they're selected, we kept finding year after year that the people of color, especially Black leaders in our network, just were not able to raise the same amount of capital as our white counterparts. So we had known that for years. We'd been talking about it for years, but sort of coming into a research partnership with a well-known, well-regarded leader in our sector, i.e. the Bridgespan Group, it was sort of the power of that collaboration that I also think allowed us to get this message to break through. So we essentially turned over a good chunk of our data to Bridgespan to really solidify and articulate the depth of what that racial inequity looked like for leaders of color. So after their data-driven analysis, they came back with some pretty jaw-dropping statistics, which I think led to so much attention in some of the outlets that you mentioned, CJ, that when you looked at the revenues of Black-led organizations in our pipeline, the revenues for those organizations were 24% smaller than the revenues of their white-led counterparts in the 3 years following application to Echoing Green. The disparities got even more substantial when you focused on unrestricted net assets. The assets for Black-led organizations were 76% smaller than white-led organizations. So that disparity is awful. It gets even worse when you look at unrestricted net assets, which many of us in this sector recognize is essentially a proxy for trust or lack thereof if you're garnering much less support. But then I think sort of the thing that really sort of tipped this data into red light zone was when we sort of drilled down and looked at a subset of our community, Echoing Green's Black Male Achievement Fellows. It was a signature fellowship that we started a number of years ago in partnership with the Open Society Foundations to invest in leaders who are working to improve the life opportunities of men and boys of color in our country. Our Black Male Achievement Fellows are not all African-American men, but about 80% or so are. And when we actually dug in and looked at their ability to generate funding, we found that the disparities were just off the chart. So the assets of Black-led organizations, the revenues of Black-led organizations in the Black Male Achievement Fellowship Program were 45% smaller than the revenues of their white-led counterparts in the Black Male Achievement Fellowship, but the unrestricted net assets were 91% smaller. So again, it's like the nesting doll phenomenon. It's like disparity on top of disparity on top of disparity. And so, we were able to show with data alongside with deep qualitative interview data that the Bridgespan Group was able to do with leaders across the sector outside of the Echoing Green community as well, that these racial disparities in revenue just were so entrenched. They were the same across education levels, including the stark difference in unrestricted net assets. We found that these disparities were quite intersectional, meaning that Black women founders consistently received less support than either Black men or white women. And again, I think it added to the chorus of research and findings that others had affirmed over the years. Amazing research done by groups like Race Forward, the First Nations Development Institute, Candid, New Prophet. They all were showing that these patterns existed. And what we heard from our friends and partners at places like New Prophet, that these disparities continue as organizations attempt to grow. New Prophet found that during the mezzanine stage, that Black and Latinx leaders we're receiving only about 4% of funding in sort of these big bet categories, even though they make up about 10% of nonprofit leaders. And it just sort of, again, the disparities continued. And even when you look at sort of the big bets methodology is defined by the Bridgespan group, when you look at those bets made between 2010 and 2014, only 11% of those went to organizations led by people of color. And even when you get underneath that, about a third of that is Jeff Canada and the Harlem Children's Zone. So again, it just sort of underscores what many of us already knew, and that has been data that has been released, that when you look at about $40 billion in grants made by foundations every year, only about 8% go to communities of color. So that was the research. People have been talking about it for years. I think it was elevated because it just amplified and reinforced what we were seeing in the spring and summer of this year.
Thank you for the years of work that you put towards that, all the data to come out with those findings. Very, very helpful, very interesting. We'll definitely send around all those links after so everyone can see them. But truly eye-opening work. So thank you. I know that took literally years, almost 10 years or so to do. So thank you for that, and
Sure.
really appreciate that. So my next question is going to be about after you released the work with Bridgespan, and then some of these events over the summer started occurring. One thing that came out was we really, Echoing Green, came together with a big idea. It's funny, in the previous webinar, you talked with Grameen and Blue Meridian, and one of the conclusions they came to is you have to have a big idea to round funders around, to get everyone inspired, excited, to get these kind of mega gifts. And so we had that conversation, I think it was in July or August, where we came up with this big idea. So Sheryl, what is Echoing Green's big idea? And tell me exactly how the fund breaks down.
Sure. So I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball at you, CJ, because I think this is a really important point, and I think it's both ends. So I can't, in sort of good faith, answer this question without sort of laying down the predicate that you can't talk about this work without talking about power and the differential in power, right? And I am of the mind, and I can't remember, I don't know whether this is Rob Reich or other writers about philanthropy as an industry, the analysis that big philanthropy fundamentally is an exercise in power. It is the direction of private assets of folks with money towards some public influence. That's not pejorative. I think that's just a statement of fact. And I wanted to sort of lay that out on the table because it's not just about having a big idea, but in some ways, what itch are you scratching for a powerful group of constituents within the country, right? And I think in many ways, our story is that our scratch met that itch, right? So when you saw the outpouring of folks who were like, OMG, WTF, we got to do something around racial equity, and the floodgates opened, this was money looking for a solution, right? It wasn't, Echoing Green had been at this a long time. We had been sort of sharing our thoughts in this pipeline of incredible leaders of color, but it wasn't until it was deemed that there was a problem here and we better do something about it that these connections were able to be forged quickly, robustly, with intention. So I just think you got to give the context to then how did we start to talk about and frame the big idea? And we worked with you on all of that. And in many years, in many ways, again, wasn't new work, but it was like, how do you package what we've been doing for years, right? To be able to share our story in a way that resonated with a group of folks who were like, I got to solve this problem, and I got to figure out some vendors to help me solve this problem. So what we did at Echoing Green, and again, I think this was a part of our learning journey, that like most of us, we're mission driven. And every day we keep our heads down, and our key constituent are our social entrepreneurs, our fellowship community that we work for every day. But it often, certainly a realization for me, that we talk the fellowship talk incredibly well, but we probably were not aligned in how we talked about our work to potential funders. I just don't think we were as good as we needed to be, because we were so focused on our fellows community. So it was a great exercise in generating this racial equity fund that allowed us to turn the tide on this. And I think what made it important was, number one, there was something audacious and ambitious about setting a big, hairy, audacious goal. This is a big problem. We got to meet the moment, and $50 million as an aspiration was something that you could rally people behind, get them excited about, and seem to have the heft and size and gravitas that might want to get folks involved. So I think that was one thing. And then it was like, so what are you going to do? And trying to talk about the work with a couple of key levers that, number one, we as an organization could pull, that we could be held accountable to, but it was also a way to offer a menu of things that donors could get excited about, get engaged around, and that in totality they could see as a potential robust solution to this really tough, thorny structural problem that we were all trying to grapple with. So I think that's kind of the backstory. And for us, it was to continue to do the work that we were doing, but talk about it in a different way. So here are the three pillars of our racial equity fund. We have made it sort of digestible, saying if you remember nothing else about this racial equity fund, remember the numbers 500, 5,000, 10,000, 500, 5,000, 10,000. And for those who, like us, sort of struggled with how do you get a funder who will often say, oh, you're just too small, you're working with these early stage leaders, you only invest in 30 new enterprises a year, you don't achieve scale. It was the first time we were able to go into the market and talk about scale in a way that quickly resonated with potential donors. Again, these are 500, 5,000, 10,000, big numbers alongside the 50 million. And for us, that broke down into the following programming. So we made a commitment that over the next 3 years of this racial equity fund, and the 3-year time horizon was important because it allowed us to move out of the feast or famine, like treadmill, hamster wheel of just doing, one-off 1-year gifts, but to have long-term funders and partners in this work. But we made the commitment that we were going to invest in 500 new and existing Echoing Green social entrepreneurs, BIPOC leaders who had their shoulder to the wheel around racial equity. So we were going to deliver, new activists, new innovators, new disruptors who in this moment, when the world was receptive to this work, we were going to flood the zone with a whole cadre of next gen leaders, which was really exciting, really attractive. Then the 5,000 was another way for us to get at scale, where we were really proud and excited to take a program that we had started just the year before, where we were working with Black and brown, mostly Black students on historically Black college and university campuses, introducing them to the concepts and precepts of social innovation to enable them to be the next generation change agents for their communities that we all need them to be. We had demonstrated that we were able to generate a lot of enthusiasm, do wonderful work with about 1,000 young people at 5 different HBCUs. This racial equity fund was our ability to turbocharge that work of reaching many more early stage social entrepreneurs that we would never otherwise be able to touch through our small fellowship program. And then the last piece of 10,000 was a way for us to translate all of the really deep and meaningful employee engagement work that we have done with our corporate partners over the years. And number one, and do 2 things. One was to name that work as a powerful path to allyship in this moment, right? So how do we take incredibly important sectoral actors, business leaders, and educate them, upskill them around what racial equity means, what it means to show up as an ally in this moment, and how do you help them be the change agents within their companies that we need them to help tip the scales towards this work. And when you sort of married that theory of change with the opportunity to scale our employee engagement work, where we typically work with about 1,000 business leaders a year, to essentially triple that over the next 3 years. So to go from 1,000 a year to about 3,000 or so a year for the next 3 years, and to get to what we think is potentially a really powerful tipping point of working with up to 10,000 corporate leaders. That then began to be meaty enough, substantial enough, that donors who, again, other in any other context probably would not have engaged with us, for them to not only pay attention but also double down and partner with us in very meaningful ways.
Yeah, and Cheryl, I heard you say the word scale about 10 times. I think that's a really important takeaway, that these mega philanthropists and donors are looking for solutions that help them scale whatever it is they're working on. I think that was also something when we first started working together, you guys were asking us to think about, and how do we scale? And so this fund really outlined those metrics needed to get to scale. One thing you were also talking about connections, and it was, I believe you said, they're scratching the itch. Let's talk about some connections. As when you're talking about that, you're referring to donors and or organizations that you've worked with a while. And I think it's really important that we go through and outline these mega donors. And I would like you to tell me how many years that you've actually worked, known, or they have been a donor of yours, to Echoing Green. So, for example, for McKinsey and Bridgespan, how many years have you been working with them?
So again, I don't know if folks paid attention, but when McKinsey Bezos Scott announced, that $1.7 billion largesse, simply extraordinary, to 116 groups, it was initially completely anonymous. I mean, I'm hearing all this secondhand, that she made a commitment wanting to invest in, BIPOC leaders, LGBTQ leaders, women-led organizations. We had a very trenchant analysis around, how do you invest in proximate leaders in all of their forms. But she did it through advisors that none of us had any visibility for, right? So I think the work that she did with philanthropic advisors that we were known to, and that we had built up trust and credibility with, that was really was our ability to get in front of a donor like that, right? I just think that's, over time, we had enough relational capital to even be in the back of someone's mind. So when these lists start being generated, groups like Echoing Green, and there were, 5 other Echoing Green folks on the list, I think that's sort of, over the years, the power of our network.
Yep.
Folks started to know us enough that allowed, these, over the course of a decade, over the course of 15 years, to be in the mix.
Yep. I remember that conversation so well. It was such an interesting conversation. And I remember the fire drill after that. We were trying to get all the materials together. Oh, that was fun. Well worth it, obviously.
Absolutely.
What a ride that was. How about Jerome L. Green? How long have you been working with them?
Yeah, Jerome L. Green Foundation, an extraordinary philanthropic organization that part of its remit has been to support next generation talent. And we had been working with them for, I want to say, 6 or 7 years. They had been wonderful fellows that underwritten many of our fellows. But it was interesting that we had actually cycled out of their grant making docket, right? Like it happens with a lot of us. We had a good run. They really were happy with the work, but they had gone through a strategy refresh, and we had lost them as a funder. But this was also, I think, an example of when you've got a good relationship, and funders all of a sudden recognize, my goodness, we've got to raise our hand in this moment around racial equity, that they're looking for trusted partners, and we were top of the list because they knew us. So they came back to us even though we had exited their docket.
Yep. How about Skull, which actually has gone, the relationship has even gone even farther. I should announce for you that, or for our audience, that Sheryl is, we're speaking to a board member of Skull right now. So Sheryl, congrats on that appointment.
Thank you.
But how long you been working with them?
Yeah, I mean, this is another example where, again, maybe the McKinsey Bezos Scott is, things come out of the blue, and because you're known in particular networks, you get visibility. And I will say the coda to what you said is, also as a smaller nonprofit that was always under, didn't have the fundraising capabilities that we needed until we started working with you and your team, CJ, is that I shudder to think how many opportunities we left on the table over the years. Because when, speed and competence, all in real time is required, for many years, we didn't have the bandwidth to execute on a lot of these opportunities. But in real time, we were able to respond, get back in front of them. And I do think those signals that we were doing good work and we were responsive and capable, and, every I dotted, every T crossed. I think that was an essential part of that story. Jerome L. Green, it's a reminder that a relationship is a relationship is a relationship. And we were so grateful to the Green Foundation for being good friends. And even though we were sad to have exited, we think we did it with competence, being good partners, but continued to stay in touch. And then out of the blue, something happens and people remember you. And then for Skull, I mean, I don't know how many folks are in the social innovation ecosystem. We're a very small community, relatively speaking. We are a growing field and growing movement, but we all know one another, and we are good actors and colleagues and friends. But in this moment, when Skull, to their credit, as sort of the big kahuna in the field, right? They are really the leading light relative to resources, their global footprint, their ability to convene, their signal of saying racial equity, racial justice works, raising their hand, not only deploying resources around this issue in this moment, but also tapping, a member of the ecosystem like me, who's been thinking a lot about this, was really, really important. So it's another example of how does your expertise meet the moment, and that was our story with Skull.
Good. I heard a lot in there: trust. I heard relationships, being responsive, having capabilities, and really just, I heard years and years and years there, 10 years, 6 years, 7 years. And I think that actually applies to all of these major gifts, and correct me if I'm wrong. Mostly all of them have been in the 5+ year relationship category. And I just think that's important to know, that this takes a long time to build these great relationships through trust and proving results and metrics. So congratulations to you. It's really, really exciting to hear. So I want to talk then very quickly about your path to the next 15 million. One question that we get a lot, I know at our firm, is, what is an executive director's role within fundraising? The questions are: how much time should an executive director or CEO be spending on fundraising? How much time should your development team be spending? How much team members do you need? Are you doing everything on Zoom? How many meetings do you go on a week? Tell me a little bit about your role, and what your process is in terms of fundraising.
Yeah, so I'm sure, this is not going to be, terribly, insightful to all the nonprofit EDs on the call. Like we live, there's the tension in our work is we come to the work because we're mission driven. I just got off a call with, over 100 Echoing Green Fellows, post-election, thinking, what comes next? How do we process this? How do we evaluate? Like, we're drawn to the work because we're mission-driven people, and it is always a challenge to recognize as your organization grows and you are pulled farther away from the work that it got you your start in the first place. That has been a journey for me. And it's a combination of, number one, we are at a size, relatively speaking, we are now specialized enough that I spend, 85+% of my time fundraising. And it's
85.
yeah, it's probably a little lumpy because, in the zeal to raise a fund, we're trying to front load and raise as much of it as we can so we can really dig in and now implement the work. I'm probably spending closer to 91% of my time fundraising because we're really taking advantage of the moment, the urgency of the moment, the possibilities in this moment. But I will also say that was really hard for me to do even a year ago before Echoing Green had, its first ever high level COO. Again, I just couldn't do it because I had other things to do. But it was sort of a combination of the infrastructure gearing up alongside the opportunity, alongside, the capability that you all have helped us build that we just didn't have before.
Yeah. 91% of your time is spent with me on the fundraising front lines. Oh, you must be sick of me.
Never, but CJ, it's Zoom all day, every
All
day,
day, all the
all
time.
day. And I have to say, in a weird sort of way, I've been at this for almost 20 years, and I have lived out of a suitcase. I have not lived in my apartment for 18 years. Like I was telling somebody, my oven broke 4 years ago. I had a sabbatical a few months ago. I finally got my oven fixed because I was never home to have the people come in and fix it for me. And it was sort of this aha moment that I am way more productive now. And sort of some of that exhaustion that was like planes, trains, automobiles, I don't have that anymore. And the opportunity to engage with and be fully present and meet a lot of people is really important. And I've heard some of my colleagues say that in a wonderful way, go back to this concept around power, when you no longer have to get on a plane to go to a potential donor in their surroundings, in their setting, you going to them, in some ways, it sort of levels the playing field in a really interesting way. And I think it's made, to me, a lot of the conversations more authentic and more real.
Yeah. I found that just the amount of time it takes to get in front of a donor has been chopped in a quarter, right?
Yeah.
You no longer need to wait till get a reservation at XYZ restaurant and, Subway breaks down on your way and it's delayed another month. Found that fundraising much quicker in this time, albeit, I mean, it's on Zoom and stuff like that, but still, I feel as though just the time now is much shorter. Okay, thank you, Sheryl.
Oh, and so CJ, can I also ask, I will, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but the notion of, I used to do a lot of these meetings by myself, and I don't do that anymore. That's why I see you all day, every day, right?
Yeah.
So I'm with you and your colleagues, and I think part of it was, I think was a little naive. I was sort of like, everybody's busy, let's divide and conquer. I will sort of download when I get up, but I realized the amount of friction I was causing, because I'd go on to the next meeting, I'd forget to type up my notes, I'd miss a nuance, and recognizing that this is a team sport. And I feel silly saying that. I don't understand why it took me so long to get that insight. Again, I felt like I was bothering people and I should be able to do it myself, but it was very clear that it's all hands on deck, and sort of the machinery that we've been able to build, that was sort of a breakthrough for me as well.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, you bring someone, myself or someone from our team on every single call, everything. And it's great because we can listen in, just type away, and then run with whatever needed to be done after that. And it's also great because it gives your development team a chance to build relationships, because you can kind of pass them off after you've been on the initial call. You say, okay, you've met them, go. It's a pretty efficient system, and thank you for bringing us on those calls. We really do enjoy it. Okay, Sheryl, One question for you, and I know we're getting close to 2 o'clock, and I wanted to bring up this question because it actually has come up on a few other webinars that we've sat in, or I've listened to you talk, and I know it's a common concern or just a thought. Is especially now, given the shift in the political landscape, and do you think that we've touched on this before, but do you think that this is going to be a moment, or do you think that racial equity will be a philanthropic priority for years to come? And how do you think it's going to be dealt with down the line?
Uh, yeah, that's a tough one. So, um, look, I'm someone who studied African American history. Wrote my thesis on pre-Civil War America. Um, this is a long, long journey, right? It is the quintessential conundrum of our country, right? We have been struggling for 400 years. I was saying, there have only been like 5 slavocracies in the history of the world. We're one of them, but we're the only one that also had as a founding ideas this extraordinary notion of liberty and rights for all, right? So this weird tension that is our founding story that has led to such a long struggle around meeting that latter ideal. And it just shows up, and I'm reminded every day how hard this work is, and the fits and starts that happen. And I'll stop, I'll give you some real numbers for why, for me, the jury is still out on this. I'm sure most folks saw at the end of the summer when Candid and the Center for Disaster Philanthropy, they put out that really interesting report that said, look, donors showed up in such a generous and extraordinary way during the first half of this calendar year. They gave $11.9 billion in response to COVID-19. Like, that's unbelievable. Far exceeded philanthropy for like all previous disasters. And I'm sure if you add it all up, what the philanthropy did around COVID will just stand the test of time. It was really amazing. But they actually then went back and dug into where that money went. And I thought there were a couple of data points that were really concerning. So despite, the disproportionate impact of COVID on communities of color, how we know that this economic shutdown looked like status quo for many of us, but looked like depression level economics for so many folks and marginalized folks of color. That report found that only 5% of foundation and public charity funding went specifically for BIPOC folks, right? So we've been having this conversation. We know the disproportionate impact, but yet and still, there was not an uptick in the way that you would expect to see. And then they also found, even though there was a lot of talk and patting on the back around how people relaxed all of their reporting requirements. They got money out the door quickly. Even like the folks at the helm of trust-based philanthropy started a petition and got people to sign on how they were going to, aspire to the trust-based philanthropy principles. This report also found that despite these foundations' commitment to providing flexible support for grantees, few awards that showed up in this data set were specifically identified as general support. So look, I think this is what happens where the rhetoric gets out in front of the reality. And so I want to see if any of this rhetoric turns into fundamental changes in the way that philanthropy does its work and how philanthropists and mission-driven organizations come together. I don't know, CJ. I think it's too early to tell. I just do.
Okay, jury's still out. I like that quote. So if you have a question, please do share it on the Q&A, and we'll collect those. One question that actually was carried over from last time, and I believe it was from Chamika Alphonse. I'm probably screwing up that name, but from Build New York City. And I thought it'd be a really good question for you, Sheryl. She asked in the last webinar, we were talking about funder circle, getting to the table. And she said, as a leader of color, how do you break into those circles? How do you get to the table? And I think you addressed some of that in your Bridgespan work. So I'd be curious to how you respond to that question.
I know that's such a good question, and it is really, really hard. And I think that, I heard someone smartly say that in part, um, what makes this so hard for leaders of color, for women, for young people in particular, is that the personal becomes the structural. And we as human creatures, this concept of homophily, like invests in like hangs out with like, right? And when you see sort of how networks are built, they're homophilous. They're very they're not diverse on a whole host of categories. So it is very hard for folks, who look like me to get into these circles. So I think there are a couple ways to tackle it. I think sort of for us, the Bridgespan study, I think it was a seminal moment for us to insert ourselves into a conversation, into a dialogue. We've been having this conversation for a decade, but sort of being in partnership with a credible, trusted sector actor like Bridgespan was a game changer for us. And I will say they have been tremendously amazing partners. And I remember a conversation that I had with them, and I was like, you guys do amazing work. You should use your privilege as the best form of allyship. And they've done it. They have shown up in powerful ways. So how are you aligned with partners who open up space for you in networks? I think secondly, continuing to show up and making clear that your sector understands your expertise and what you have to teach the sector. I always assumed that most folks knew what Echoing Green did and what we worked. I was like, I talk all the time. People are sick of hearing from me. And it was very clear to me that that was not the case, that there's so much going on, sort of the way you talk about your message, the clarity of the message, that still takes more work. And then I do think increasingly figuring out what are intermediary organizations that are going to leverage their proximity to networks to create space for you to get in. And in many ways, that's what Echoing Green has tried to do with our fellows community, where we're at tables. And, when I talk about Girl Trek on calls like this, when I talk about Push Black on calls like this, our responsibility to bring in new voices, new leaders into these conversations, it is all hands on deck moment. Like you just got to come at it from every angle imaginable. And it is really hard to do. And for funders, I wrote an article recently saying, I came out of the healthcare world, and sort of the work, that Atul Gawande talked about, like the checklist, right? Sort of the power of something so easy to help break down complex things. So pilots use checklists, increasingly intensivists use checklists. You as a funder, where's your checklist, right? What networks have I reached out to in the past month? When I look at my portfolio and I recognize that there are not enough folks of color in here, how many phone calls did I make to new networks, right? Just the work of building those muscles, we all have to do all of that at the same time.
Yep. Thank you. I remember back in March, making phone calls after phone call after phone call to communicate during that time, when COVID was just starting, but picking up the phone and cultivating relationships. I remember you probably made over 75 different calls in that first week or so, but you're constantly on the phone and constantly setting up meetings and making those calls. So very nice. We had a few questions about data, and I'll just pick one of the questions. You were talking about it in the Bridgespan research. You said, the question is, has Echoing Green been able to also track ROI data? And how, if so, how has that bolstered the case for access to capital? Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, I hope I'm understanding the conversation correctly, the question correctly about have we been able to track ROI. You know, I think this is a great example of how you can leverage other infrastructure to answer the questions that you want answered. So I'll go back to what I said earlier, that our Vice President of Knowledge, Liza Miller, just a brilliant data professional who recognized the power of joining the Global Accelerator Learning Initiative out, or GALI, out of Emory University, right? Again, we didn't have the capacity to sort of build out all the ROI modeling, but we knew groups that were doing it and that could. So by partnering with them, it allowed us to leverage that comprehensive data to help us tell our own story. And I think figuring out, if you don't have the internal capability to do that kind of data work, figuring out the right types of partnerships, I think is a really great model. And I would say it's worked really, really well for us. But I also think the data piece has allowed us to build out new programming. So I mentioned that part of our work was to provide funding to 500 BIPOC leaders in the next couple of years. Our bread and butter is identifying and selecting new leaders. This is the first time in our history that we are going to invest in up to 400 existing Echoing Green Fellows to provide them with follow-on funding, because we have this data to show that even though they're doing amazing work, they've made incredible progress, because they're leaders of color, they're still hitting these inequities as they're trying to scale their organizations. So we're using that data to also create a pool of funding to provide them with follow-on funding. So there's a data play here that I think is powerful on a whole bunch of levels.
Yep. And that's perfect, Sheryl. That actually is exactly at 1:58. I just want to use the last few minutes just to really thank you. Thank you for the time. Thank you for walking us through this and really addressing some issues that are very difficult to talk about. And thank you for being open and honest with us in this entire community. I know that I personally benefited from just hearing from you, and I'm sure that a lot of others on the phone have as well. Thank you for all you're doing at Echoing Green. We love you and all your colleagues. You guys are doing incredible work over there. If anyone wants to learn anything more about what Sheryl is saying here today, everything's on their website. You can learn more about the Racial Equity Philanthropic Fund there, also about their fellows there. Anything you need, you can also contact us or Sheryl at any time. Our contact information is online. It's just CJ or group or Sheryl at Echoing Green. And finally, just a last plug, on November 17th, tune in for part 3 of our series here with David Rubenstein and Steve Orr. So hope you all join. But Sheryl, thank you. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you, CJ. Thanks for all you do. And if there are other questions that didn't get answered, I'm sure I'll talk to you in the next couple of hours, and happy to provide follow-up answers to folks who we didn't get a chance to talk to.
Very good. Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining.
Bye-bye. Bye.